Okay, so today we're picking up with feudalism and the manor economy. If you remember, we were talking about the fact that the Europeans were going to be looking for a new system of rule because of the invasions by the Magyars, by the Vikings, by the Vandals, by the Visigoths, pretty much everybody that was trying to invade. They are going to want to find something different because the kings and the emperors are not working. You're not getting protection the way you need it. And so what they're going to come up with is feudalism, and feudalism is going to be the answer. Now, feudalism is a loosely organized system of rule in which you have a powerful local lord who is going to divide up their land among their lesser lords, who are called the vassals. And the vassals are going to pledge their service and loyalty to the lords. So the land that they have or what they own is called a fief, and a fief could be anywhere from a few acres. It could be all the way up to hundreds of square miles. It kind of depended on how much land the king wanted to give you or the emperor wanted to give you. And so this land or this fief would include peasants that were kind of part and parcel with it. They came with the land and they were there to work the land. So it's kind of this pyramid system. At the top you've got the king. Below him you have the vassals. Under that is the peasants, and you have protection that kind of trickles down, that the king is supposed to protect the vassals are supposed to protect the peasants, and then you have service and loyalty that go up. So the peasants serve and are loyal to the vassals, and the vassals serve and are loyal to the king. So that's kind of how this whole thing works, that they are supposed to work together. Now, some of the vassals are going to be part of the nobility. So you will have the king and then the nobles, and then the vassals or knights, and then the peasants. So it kind of depends on which triangle or which pyramid you're looking at, but basically it's the upper classes and all the way down to the peasants at the very bottom. The peasants are always at the bottom, the king's always at the top, so makes that pretty easy. Well, like I said, you do have knights that are in there, and they come from this world of warriors. You have to have people to fight, to protect you, because that's the whole point of the thing anyway. So there's lots of battles for power, and the nobles will be trained for warfare. That's their main job, is that they know how to fight war. That's the big thing. And so the nobles or the nobility highly prized skills as a knight, and so most of them become knights, and knights are mounted warriors, and they fight from horseback, which is an advantage. It's a huge advantage. And they would start training to be a knight at the age of 7, and so they were sent to a castle which was not their father's castle. They're sent away to somewhere else because, you know, their dad might be too easy on them, so they have to go somewhere else where they're going to get the toughest training possible. And that's where they learn to ride and to fight. And they keep their armor and their weapons in good condition. And it's a pretty difficult training, and you had to observe very strict discipline. If you weren't doing your job or you weren't doing what you were supposed to, you were harshly punished. At the age of 18 or 21, it kind of depends on the region, at 18 or 21 you were ready to be made a knight, and you would swear your loyalty to your father or to your lord, the noble of who you were going to be fighting to protect. Now, fighting is going to lessen by the 1100s, and so tournaments between knights are going to become popular because they're not actually fighting wars against each other, but they still want to prove that I'm better than you at riding my horse or at sword play or whatever it was. And so a powerful lord would invite other knights to come enter into contests of fighting skills, and that was a way to show that I've got better knights than you do, sort of thing. It's still very dangerous because many knights were still killed even in these play tournament kind of things. So it's not like you're safe, but it is safer than going to actual war where you're out to kill each other all the time. So like I said, you would be sent off to your father's castle, and the castles were created during the Middle Ages because you needed to fortify your homes, especially when all the fighting was taking place. You can't just have a wooden house and expect that nobody's going to be able to get to it and destroy it. So you have to build these strongholds. And the stronghold started out as just a keep, and a keep is a wooden tower that would have a fence around it, and it was surrounded by these water-filled ditches called moats. And so you'd have a moat, and not all moats had water in it, but most of them do. By the end of the Middle Ages, most of them do. But they don't start out that way. They actually start out as just this ditch that you could fill with water, but typically you would throw old swords down there, or rocks and anything jagged, to make it difficult for you to get up the hill to the keep. That's the big thing, that you don't want them to get to the keep. However, as people gain more and more money and power, they are gradually going to become larger. They're going to become more grand. So because it's a status symbol, that if you had the biggest castle around, that meant you had the most money or you had the most power. So that's part of it as well. So eventually those wooden towers will transform into stone castles with high walls and towers and drawbridges and even wider moats, and that's where we start getting the water-filled moat and all that kind of thing. In case of attack, and if you ever were attacked, most likely you would be put under siege, which means somebody's going to sit outside your walls, outside your castle, and starve you out. So you would want to store up water and food. So you wanted to have access to those two things. Now, tunneling was an option. If you wanted to attack the castle, you could tunnel under the wall and make the wall collapse. But it's really dangerous work, and it's very tedious work. There's lots of time involved in it, lots of manpower involved in that. And so it was an option, but it's kind of hard to do. The role of noble women in this whole setup is that the lady usually became the lord of the manor while her father or her husband was away. If he was off fighting or training or visiting or going to visit the king or whatever he was doing, while the man of the house was away, the lady became the lord of the manor. And so she helped to supervise the vassals, she managed the household, she performed whatever was necessary in terms of agricultural or medical tasks. Typically the lady of the manor was asked to sit in for childbirths and help out and that kind of thing. Women's rights to inheritance at this time was very severely limited. Very little of them had any property. They had a dowry. And remember, the dowry was what went with you when you got married. And that had started all the way back in Greek times. And this is something that's going to carry over into European tradition. And the women would receive land as a part of their dowry. If they wouldn't get a whole ton, because typically land was set aside for sons, that if you had a brother, he would get most of the land, and if you got lucky, you would get a little piece to take with you to your marriage so that someone would want to marry you because, you know, you have money and you have land and power and that kind of thing. So marriage was more for land. If a woman was wealthy, she usually had a lot of suitors. She had a lot of people who wanted to marry her, and they would go through a lengthy negotiation process. If the husband died, women would regain their rights to their dowry lands, usually. Not always, but usually they would get their dowry lands back, so that way then they could maybe go somewhere else and get married or be married off again. So just like the sons who were sent off for training to become knights, the daughters were also sent away for training to friends or relatives' houses, homes, in order to learn the women's skills like spinning and weaving and supervising servants. You can't do that around your own castle because everybody knows you. So if you want to learn how to order servants around, you need to go somewhere where they don't know you. They'd learn how to read and write, although not all of them would learn how to read and write. They'd learn enough to be able to keep household accounts and that kind of thing. Because a daughter's main duty was to get married and then to be a dutiful wife and loyal to her husband and have as many children as possible. Because the infant mortality rate at this time period is very, very bad. You're going to do some readings later on about various queens who will get the best of healthcare, and even some of them could have 10 or 12 kids and maybe 3 or 4 survive. So infant mortality rates are very, very high at this time. So that's why they wanted them to have so many kids. With the whole concept of knights, you get this idea of chivalry, and chivalry is a code of conduct of how you should behave, and knights were to be brave and loyal and true to their word. They were supposed to fight fairly. They were supposed to be generous to their enemy. A good example was that knights were not supposed to attack another knight until he had had a chance to put on his armor and get his weapons and prepare for the battle. So that was considered proper conduct for knights. If you captured a knight in battle, you were supposed to treat him well. You couldn't torture him or anything like that. And if he promised to pay his ransom, so if you captured one, you could hold him for ransom. His family would pay to get him back. And if he promises to pay his ransom, you were supposed to release him, because a knight is true to his word. So if he promises to pay, he would pay, is kind of the idea. Well, this code of chivalry is eventually going to help women because they gain a new status, that they are weak and inferior, and they need to be protected and cherished and loved from a distance and that kind of thing. And so a new job sort of appears, the troubadour. And a troubadour was a wandering poet who is really going to take on this idea of chivalry and adopt it as, the ultimate form of love and that kind of thing. They will write love songs about a woman's perfection and her beauty and her wit, and tragic love stories and that kind of thing, of how the woman was so fair, and the gentle knight could not accost her, and he rescues her and she dies in his arms and he loves her forevermore, and just all kinds of stuff, all the sappy love story kind of stuff that you hear about. So eventually we see the development of the manor, and this comes pretty much after all the wars, the petty wars and fights stop. We see the development of the manor, and the manor is the lord's estate. So the lord of the manor and his estate, and usually he would have one or more villages and surrounding lands on his territory, and the peasants were there to work the land. Most of the peasants were serfs, and a serf is someone who is bound to the land, like they cannot leave the land. They weren't really slaves because they couldn't be bought and sold like slaves were, but they weren't really free either because they couldn't leave their land unless they had the Lord's permission. So they had to go and ask, and usually they had to pay a fee if they wanted to go to another village and leave the Lord's land and go into another village. So it's kind of an odd relationship that they have. But this peasant-lord relationship was based on mutual rights and mutual responsibilities. That the peasants would work for several days on farming the Lord's land, so he wouldn't have to go out and do it because he's providing them with protection, right? But once the farming was done, the peasants were also responsible for helping to repair the roads or bridges and fences and all that kind of stuff. They would pay a fee when they got married. They would pay another fee if they ever inherited land, or if they were just going to the mill to grind their grain to make their bread, they'd also have to pay a fee for that. So kind of a lot of money going out of their pockets. Taxes or payments were usually due twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter. And most peasants or most serfs don't have a lot of money. And so they usually would pay in grain or fruit or eggs or chickens or baskets, whatever they could make. In exchange for their labor, they could farm several acres for themselves so that they could grow their own food for their family. In return for that, they got protection from raids and from wars, because the nobles were knights who could protect them. And they could not be forced off their land. So even though they couldn't leave without permission, they also could not be forced off. They had certain rights to be there. So in theory, they're granted food, housing, and land in return for this protection. The typical manor, in the village, usually you had several one-room huts. You would have a water mill, which was used for grinding grain, usually a church, and then your manor house, which is where the noble lived. The fields were divided up into narrow strips, and the families had strips in different fields so that the good and the bad land was going to be shared evenly. So not everybody had, if the bad land was all on the North 40, one family wouldn't just have that as their land. They would have some of the good land as well. What they're going to do is they're going to leave one half of their land unplanted, and that's called fallow. So they're going to leave one half of it fallow each year in order to regain its fertility. So they would not touch one half of their land. So they're living off half of the land that they have. This is going to lead to a very small world view, this manor lifestyle. The serfs and the peasants and even the nobles, to some extent, were very self-sufficient. The peasants for sure didn't travel a lot. They couldn't afford to. They literally couldn't afford to because of money, but they also couldn't take that amount of time to be away from their land. They needed to be there to tend it. And it also led to very little schooling as well. The daily life for peasants was pretty harsh. It's not something to enjoy. Men, women, and children all worked long hours from sunup to sundown. They all had specific jobs that they needed to get done. And they survived on a very simple diet. They would have black bread with some sort of vegetable, and it's not like really nice vegetables either. They would have peas and cabbage, turnips and onions. Very seldom did they get meat, mostly because the meat was reserved for the nobility. That was something you sold for the nobles' plates kind of thing. Sometimes they could illegally poach it from the nobles' hunting grounds, or sometimes they could fish in the river and get some meat that way, but very seldom are they able to do that. The families and the animals all slept together in a one-room hut, and partially for warmth, because in the wintertime you didn't really have a whole lot of heat, so you bring the animals in and they help to provide some body heat inside of your one-room cabin or one-room hut. But also in order to protect the animals, you would bring them in so that they wouldn't get eaten by wolves or stolen or anything like that. So hunger is pretty common, especially in late winter, for the food supply. There wasn't really a whole lot of things that would last for a very long time. They didn't have a whole lot of salt to preserve things or anything like that. The average life expectancy for villagers or for peasants at this time was about 35, so it's not really a great occupation. If you think like you guys right now are what, 15, 16, so you're like at midlife at this point. If you were a peasant, you're probably not going to survive much longer because of the harsh conditions.